Good morning, Doria. Good morning, Thea.
Good morning. I am trying to change my settings here.
Yeah. Yeah. You good? Can you hear us all right? Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yes.
Thank you for joining a couple minutes early, everyone. There's Doria. Hanging out, San Francisco. Oh, you're on mute.
Hanging out with the bridge in the background. Yep.
It's like a lovely morning.
Is it really warm enough to wear a sweater there, Doria?
Jealous.
It is. It is. It's a little chilly this morning. We've got a bunch of overcast here.
My gosh.
It
Chilly.
seems like every year the weather just gets more extreme. Like the news is always like record heat, record hurricane,
That was yesterday.
That's yesterday. Oh, today we're back to average triple digits.
Yeah.
Good. Well, the three of you make a quorum for your subcommittee, which is very exciting. We can get started right at the top of the hour. I expect James to be joining us, although we're just hit 10. Irene, I was expecting was going to join, but I did get an auto response from her a couple of days ago that she was out of the office this week. But I do know she has a lot of travel, so she might be joining us from the road or something like this. But we're all here and we're at 10. What do you think? Should we get started? Want to be respectful of everyone's time. Okay, here we go. We're recording, by the way. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the meeting for the California Agricultural Land Equity Task Force Grants and Resources Subcommittee. We're excited. This is our second subcommittee meeting following the May 9th full task force meeting. I'm going to quickly run through participation guidelines, public comment process, and do an agenda review for us. Today, we are together until noon, so we have 2 hours. Hopefully, we get a lot of work accomplished together in our time this morning. Next slide, please, Camille. Standard participation guidelines for all task force meetings. We're here to share, exchange ideas, listen to one another, and we do that in a respectful manner. And this includes the folks joining us as public commenters as well, and all staff, and try to stay on point. So today, the focus of discussion is involving grants and resources. There are other subtopics that the subcommittee, there are other subtopics that the task force does discuss and take on, but today we're focused on grants and resources, with the exception of a general public comment period we have saved towards the end of our meeting today. Next slide. Public comment process, same as always if you've joined us before. We have a form that we ask you to complete online. It's found at sgc.ca.gov/meetings-events. We ask you to fill out a separate form for each item. Today it's pretty easy because we have only 2 primary sessions, our working session and the general public comment session. And when we get time to take public comments, we'll check out the discussion queue, we'll call your name, and we'll ask you to raise your hand on Zoom so that you easily are identifiable in the participants panel. And then at that time, we'll ask you to unmute your microphone. We are expecting maybe a 2-minute time limit, but we'll see how many commenters are interested to share comments and we can adjust accordingly. Next slide. Zoom tips. Everyone, unless you are a panelist, you're muted upon entry. So if you're an attendee, you're muted. And then of course, we'll ask you to unmute when it's your time to speak. And the tools are found at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Mute and unmute is on the far left. Videos are optional. And then the raised hands feature, which again helps us to easily identify you during the public comment sessions, is down there at the bottom, kind of up towards the right-hand side with the little raised hand up. It's worth saying that if a member of the task force is joining the subcommittee meeting today as an attendee, they have to remain in observation mode only. So unfortunately, because of our Bagley-Keene compliance responsibilities, task force members who are not appointed subcommittee members observe, and the next time that we're able to discuss and hear from other task force members on their thoughts on your discussion today will be at the full task force meeting in August. Next slide. Quick review of what we hope to accomplish today. So we're capturing this all as a working session, which this is an opportunity for us to roll up our sleeves and really start to do some deeper thinking about the grants and resources subtopic. First, we'll start out by talking about our short and long-term goals. We need to give ourselves a little flagpole to aim at, right? So what is it that we're hoping to accomplish with this subcommittee? After we talk about that, then we have some existing information that has been shared with the task force in prior meetings and in advance of this meeting, and we'll use that as a platform for conversation. So back in May, at the May 9th meeting, staff had compiled a nice Excel sheet and a briefing packet where we looked at different existing grant programs and kind of did a preliminary analysis on strong points and possible areas of improvement. And we'll start kind of having a deeper dive conversation there. And then there's another document that's probably new to some, but not new to all, that was shared as part of the briefing packet for this meeting. It's called the Better Funding Report. All of these documents are available on our project website, but we'll reflect back to that document and have a conversation and see if there's any recommendations for best practices in this funding report that may be applicable to the work of the task force. Towards the end, we'll move to a conversation about topics for future discussion because this subtopic is quite large and you all identified numerous issues related to grants and resources at the May 9th meeting. So we'll look to you all as subcommittee members to provide direction on where to go next. And then we will confirm the next meeting schedule and timeframe for the next meeting. And of course, make space for general public comment. Before we move into the working session, I was tap dancing a tiny bit because I was hoping we might get James. We don't have him yet, but let's please just do a quick roll call so we're official. Member Schwartzman.
Here.
Yay. Member Robinson.
Here.
Member Rittenhouse. Wonderful. We have a quorum established. 2 other subcommittee members who are not with us today are members James Nakahara and member Irene De Barakuya.
And Megan, it looks like James is actually dialed in. I'm not sure if he's able to get off mute, maybe allowed to talk. James, are you able to communicate? Maybe not.
Yeah, hi.
There you go.
Hi. Sorry. For some reason, I'm getting like locked out of Zoom. They say that I need to sign in with the email that I registered with, but I did that. So yeah, sorry. I'm here. I'm just, yeah.
Glad you're here,
Not able-
James. Are you able to see the slide deck or should we help troubleshoot on the back end for you?
I can't see the slide deck on my phone, no. But if you email it to me, I can follow along.
Okay, I'm going to do that in one moment. And so hang tight. Thanks for
Okay.
joining. So we have James on the phone with us today. Fabulous. Okay, so I'll handle that in a quick second for you, James, and then we're going to turn to our working session, and we're going to ask Camille really to lead us in this conversation. She's been doing a lot of work on the grants and resource landscape, and so I'm here to help keep an eye on things. Tessa is here to help keep an eye on things. We have Sean in the room with Camille, so all of your staff support is available. We'll be taking notes as always. We'll produce a high-level meeting summary, just like we do for regular task force meetings. And then the recording of this session will be available on YouTube and posted to our website later. So just wanted to let folks know that we'll be tracking along. We have a slide deck to help kind of guide conversation. We might pull down the slide deck at some points to take notes real time so we can kind of see our discussion reflected in the written form there if it feels right and it makes sense since we're all virtual today. And otherwise, I think we're good to go. Camille, you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Megan. It's nice to be with you all today. Thanks for being here. So we'll jump right into the working session. And really wanted to start with something you've all seen before and is familiar to you, so won't linger for very long on this slide, but thought it might be helpful to start out with just a reminder about the language that's in the statute that establishes the task force. And so that could be kind of in the back of your mind as you're considering what this subcommittee might do to assist with the overarching goal of that task force to produce this report of recommendations for the governor and legislature. So just wanted to put this up here as a little refresher. This is the kind of ultimate goal of the task force. And then we'll be talking in the first part of this work plan about how this subcommittee might engage in the topic of grants and resources as related to this development of recommendations. So I wanted to put up a slide that is a little bit overwhelming because there's actually so many ideas here and the ideas are actually quite complex. So I don't want to, again, linger too long on this slide. I have it again later on in the presentation. We can come back to it anytime. But I just wanted to refresh everyone's memories about the kinds of things that have emerged in previous task force meetings. So that from this leg, we'll move into a discussion of what do you want your goals to be as the Grants and Resources Subcommittee? And these are some of the things that have come up in previous conversations that this subcommittee might be considered to either take one by one or to kind of bundle. We've kind of attempted to do a little bit of bundling here under these kind of headers and consider whether and how to approach any of these ideas, concerns, topics that have come up in prior meetings. So again, I wanted to kind of put this here as a bit of a refresher and to kind of get you thinking back to those past conversations so that you can consider this in talking through what your goals might be as a subcommittee. So again, you can come back to this at any point. But I thought it would be helpful for us to just start with a bigger, backing out a bigger conversation about what this subcommittee, it's its first meeting. It was established at the May 9th task force meeting. So what does this subcommittee want to take on as its goals in relation to the objective of the task force with that report of recommendations? So staff had proposed some goals. This was in our recommended action to create a subcommittee like this one. This is what we had initially proposed, examining existing resources and then providing an overview of the resource gaps, challenges, barriers, and then solutions, right? Best practices that might then become part of those recommendations. So those are just some initial ideas, and I want to sort of turn it now to subcommittee members to see your sort of first thoughts to this. Are there other things that you'd like to include? Should there be revisions to the language here? What are you imagining as members that this subcommittee should do? And I'm going to go out and just type into this a little bit as we work. Sorry, go ahead.
Doria, your hand's up, but I'll also offer folks, we have a small collegial group here. So if it makes sense to just kind of keep yourselves unmuted and talk amongst yourselves, excellent. If we run into a space where we're accidentally speaking over each other, then I'm happy to help keep a discussion queue, but I don't think we need to go quite as formal today. So let's give it a try, Doria.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'd really like to see is better understand the impact of existing programs, because I know that they have, they're varied, and it'd be really great to have some kind of a to track like the actual number of land transfers that result from X grant program, or kind of more hard numbers to understand impact, we could track in there, some of the other capacity building things that people need in order to get to the point where they can purchase land. But I think that coming up with a way to track and understand the impact of existing programs in numbers would be really helpful. And I think with one of the key metrics being the actual transfer of land to, for use for farming or tribal use, and not just like the amount of money given or anything like that, but actually like, yeah, how much are existing programs impacting our overall goal?
I'd like to see that second bullet point get broken up a little bit, just to make that, I feel like examine existing resources and resource gaps might be a little bit more appropriate for the first, moving resource gaps up to that first one. And challenges and best practices. Challenges might also be in the resource gaps if we're sticking to that. Just looking at the existing, what's already in place. I think it seems like from the review of the that list of the programs Excel sheet, and then also that better funding report, that maybe, or if we're going to leave the word challenges in there, those kind of structural challenges, challenges in the mechanism of the funding, seems like something that we could delve a little bit more in depth to be able to better present that to the full committee.
I almost would separate out, not separate out, have it be a part of the same bullet point, but have resource gaps kind of on the, and resource gaps after the structural challenges, barriers and everything. Because I think that by identifying the structural challenges, you're also indicating what resource gap you might need to address those.
Like this?
Yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Okay. We can finesse a little bit.
Yeah.
Could I just ask a clarifying question back to your previous point, Doria, about better understanding the impact of existing programs? And you called out actual transfer of land as a key metric there, but I'm wondering if you have any other metrics in mind to sort of better account for the equity dimensions of those transfers that would help us with that work. You're on mute, sorry.
So yeah, I think I have a lot in mind. One would be the raw number of transfers resulting from each program. And then you would go into the details of like who are the people who are using those programs, are they from disadvantaged, are they disadvantaged farmers? Are they not? And where, I think it's another question, where are these land transfers happening? That would be a really interesting, thing to understand. Are they all happening in certain areas and not in other areas? I think we could even think more about this, because it would be important to understand even like what kind of land it is, Is this historic farmland, or is this people kind of, trying to transition land into farmland? I think that is actually an important thing to understand too. Yeah, and acreage, how big are these transfers? How many acres are we transitioning? Those are the things that come to mind, you know, like demographics, geography, the kind of land, is it historic farmland, and the acreage.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
The SGC has some good contacts for USDA because that data's been historically difficult to come by from them, but maybe they'll be willing to or able to share from the land loan programs also.
I do feel like it'll be really hard to really assess the impact or the, you know, what's going on with those programs now without those numbers. Because we could see what it looks like now, then we can have a discussion on, you know, what we're seeing. We can make assumptions, but it's really great to work from numbers from.
And perhaps to Thea's point, if it is extremely challenging, if not impossible, to come by some of those details, that in itself might be an observation that the subcommittee would want to make sure is shared.
Right. I mean, I would imagine that, you know, they have to have some kind of report out metrics for these programs, right? They're not just running them without any kind of measures of success, right? Fully.
Yeah.
I imagine that some of these programs are a little more technical assistance based too. Not all of them are going to result in a successful transfer.
Yep.
So maybe just number of farmers served too would be a good number, and the demographics of those farmers, location of those farmers.
I would also like try to dial into that, because I think sometimes we bury a lack of effectiveness in language, you know? And so does being served means you talk to a technical assistance provider and then, you know, you spend a bunch of time with them, but nothing really came of it? Like, how do we understand the impact of technical assistance? And I say that knowing that I have benefited, you know, like greatly from technical assistance. And so I'm not devaluing it, but I also want to distinguish between, you know, interactions with technical assistance that are not helpful, but may still count as receiving services.
I imagine that's a little bit harder to get a metric on, but very valuable. Would be very valuable if we found the secret to understanding.
Maybe it's even just if they have any feedback from the people receiving services to say whether or not it was helpful. I mean, maybe something as simple as that.
Maybe we're focusing on the helpfulness is like, did it actually lead to purchase or lease of land or access to land?
Yes, exactly. That's what I mean. Did it support movement in that direction?
I think that's really important. Like not more than an hour ago, talking with two colleagues about grant programs and how in various counties people are being, you know, there's a third party entity who is acting as the bridge between the money and the recipient, and they're quote unquote helping, but that help is like sending somebody an email and being like, here's a checklist of things you need to do, not like, I'm going to make sure you have internet service and like can do this in a timely manner and like help you understand why you have to do this, help push back when you don't make, you know, all the eligibility requirements that, you know, not a lot of people fit into for many of these things. So I think it's like vetting, figuring out how to talk about or what the best practices, the values that should be associated with that kind of TA support are, I think would be really, really impactful down the line.
I totally agree.
Maybe we should make that second bullet point for best practices a little bit more detailed. Because best practices could mean a lot of different things. Maybe what you're saying, James.
Like, I think value, like picking a set of values and defining them could be a good way to like talk, you know, like transparency and like I don't know, like maybe values or maybe just maybe it is like a list of practices, but like it's more like the easier thing is to be like, I know what it doesn't look like, like I know what bad TA assistance, I know what that, yeah. So I think that's great.
Yeah, I
So-
almost want to identify like the types of TA, like how many of the resources out there are kind of light touch TA that are basically sending you lists or, connections to existing resources that you have to navigate yourself. But they're getting paid to send you those things. And kind of more heavy touch or intensive TA, which is more like coaching you through over around barriers and problems.
Coaching and like advocacy too.
Yeah,
Like
and advocacy.
kind of
That's
being like, not just like, here's how we're going to do this, but like, I'm going to go follow up and tell them how terrible this process was.
Right.
It's like,
right. Or help you find ways around these barriers, not just go, oh, I know it's hard, keep going.
right.
Maybe we're talking about here then, when we're looking at the resources or these bigger challenges and gaps, is like maybe how we could be helpful to the larger committee is how we're like, yeah, what's not working in terms of like how to pair TA as a critical piece of it with these programs that are already in place. Or I'm just trying to think of this as a way to help inform our larger committee to make the recommendations about, the existing things that are happening and how what are maybe there's some successful models or non-successful models that we could point to. It's like, let's not do this, or let's support this type of TA to make sure that grants and programs that are helping to increase access are working.
I think to that point, there are a lot of programs and nonprofits that are literally generated because the grant programs are so difficult to navigate for farmers. It's like an industry that's building upon itself simply because the programs are not effectively run or overly complicated or not accessible to communities. So I don't know what the solution is. This better funding report was really interesting to me. And I think that we could take a lot of lessons on just this second bullet point, best practices for TA, but also best practices for building, running, and administering grant programs. There's definitely some recommendations that we could pull forward from that. And so, yes, to pair TA, but also to remove some of these barriers and challenges that we find with the grant program so that we don't keep having to build new nonprofit programs simply because something was not built with best practices in mind to begin with.
I really liked how that better funding report was framed in that way too. Yeah, it really got at those structural barriers and going to the source of really where are the issues and barriers, instead of just creating a short-term solution, which is TA to, help jump through the hoops. Why don't we look at the hoops and why they exist in the first place?
There's a lot here. You've all done already an amazing job generating a list of goals. I don't want to at all cut off this conversation, but I'm wondering how this is feeling, seeing this here. And this is not the way it has to be. I'm just trying to capture these things as you're talking. So if ever that doesn't feel quite represented the way you meant it, let me know. But I'm wondering if you all take a look at this again. How are you feeling? Any more to add? Any things to adjust?
I think the only other thing I would add, and I do think this is a great list, is I'd also like to understand how many people are applying to the programs as opposed to how many people are able to get awards from them.
That was a particularly interesting part of that better funding report. The application, the time capacity for applications. And it really gets to this, and just anecdotally, the experience, with recent programs which are serving, maybe not necessarily for land, but directly for farmers and ranchers or business owners. The oversubscription rates are enormous. Many of the when those funds are available, they're heavily oversubscribed, and there was a mention of that in that better funding report that I thought was interesting, because what about all that time that was spent on those applications, and how do we just avoid that altogether if possible?
Mm. Any other thoughts here on this? And again, this is really a draft, right? I think the subcommittee, as you continue to meet, might want to come back to some of these proposed goals, see which you would like to address in which ways. And we will bring this back up again when you're thinking forward, right? What work do you want to do from this moment? But how's everyone feeling with this list now? In terms of continuing, maybe diving in, you've already brought up some of the things you've been learning from, or that you found valuable in that better funding report and things like that. So we can get into some of those specifics, but I don't want to rush this conversation if anyone has other thoughts.
Could I just throw out an idea for organizing this a little, like even looking along that first line where we have existing resources, structural challenges, and resource gaps. I'm wondering the extent to which we focus on those structural challenges. To me, we're trying to look at, like I see there's the whole, structural barriers to land access. Then we have specific programs that, in some way are designed to facilitate land transfers. And then third, this whole TA discussion, which is the pathways to those programs. But in examining those structural challenges, are we trying to understand the extent to which these programs as currently designed address those structural challenges? And then the effectiveness of the TA in providing pathways there, which sort of, as we take this away and try and, I think like the direction of this would require some much deeper analysis, but just to inform that analysis, to have a clear idea of your priorities in terms of, like we could look at structural challenges all day long, but sort of what are the specific connections we're trying to tease out through that work? It'd be helpful.
I had to step away for a sec, so I missed a bit, but I feel like I just want to say that it's important to me, like first and foremost is around actual land transfers, understanding that, and then getting into the weeds of the TA is kind of after that, I feel like I'd like to focus most energy around understanding actual land transfers, and then secondarily going into the TA support that's not even, it's probably not even intended towards the land transfer, like just supporting it.
Some of these programs are pretty new, but I have to say I'm also very interested to learn of the land purchases, acquisitions, transfers that have occurred through these programs. How long do farmers typically hold on to those lands? And then what happens next? So it's a topic of interest at FarmLink right now, is to understand when someone is having a public benefit and receiving public funds in order to acquire lands, to ensure that that public benefit continues in its succession, rather than then creating some kind of a windfall for those buyers out there that we are making a concerted effort to avoid here. So, it doesn't just unduly benefit investors or foreign buyers or consolidation or any of these issues that are so prominent right now. And therefore, what mechanisms can we add to these programs to ensure that succession is occurring to the same farmer communities that we're trying to serve through these programs, and it's not just kind of a one-off?
I guess a follow-up to that too is sort of the universe of this analysis. Are we looking at existing programs within California, given that the recommendations are going to be focused on California? But in terms of what you all would like to be looking at, is it just the effectiveness of those programs? Are we looking to look outside of California, outside of the US, at other programs that have similar objectives, that operate in different ways, that could help inform recommendations? Or is it simply a gap analysis of what's working and what's not working in California? Again, whatever we can be doing that's helpful for you.
Yeah. For me, I think it's a gap analysis first and foremost, so we can understand what we're working with. And so we're not recreating things that already exist that may or may not be working. And then, of course, it's always good if we have time after that is done and clear to look at examples of things that we could be doing to make what we have here better.
And I like
Apologies if these are really obvious questions. So just trying to. Sorry, Thea.
There's a delay.
Sorry, Thea, did you say something I don't think we heard?
Go ahead and finish, Sean, what you're saying.
I'm done.
It's all you.
Okay, I was just going to say that maybe in that structural challenges of the gap analysis, like you were saying, instead of just saying structural challenges, just to what degree do the existing programs address structural challenges, might be more helpful and more specific. And like Doria was saying, this gap analysis of what are we working with here? What are some of those numbers? And then if there's a program outside of California or outside of the US that is working to that degree, although it would be interesting to see if that exists given the specificity and diversity of California agriculture and the land, value here and all of the things that we're working with in the state.
I think staying California centered makes sense first. I think if there were like really great programs out there that people knew about, we would know about them maybe. But like if they were working really well, like they might be on people's radars and then thinking about how to like reapply that from some other part of the world, like would it even work in California is kind of an outstanding question too. So I think centering on the state makes sense. In addition to the overview of best practices, I'm wondering if there's, I know like each one of these bullet points is like a lot of work, and but I'm wondering if in addition to best practices, we want to kind of provide a model of like, this is like the flow chart of how this works well or something, or just like be like, this is a proposed kind of theory of how this can work well using the existing resources, kind of as like it's so, to Thea's point, like the state is very complex and diverse, and it's hard to have generalized kind of takeaways, but that's our goal. And I think we could have like in addition to best practices, a like, this is how this should look kind of thing. Like when it's working right, this is what it would look like kind of thing. I hope that makes sense. If not.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Was someone going to jump? Go ahead, Doria.
No, I was just going to say that's a great suggestion. I think that it's good to give people not just to critique, but to put forward what we think is a good practice and what would work.
One thing I'll say here, just as a point to have in the back of your minds, is that if different subcommittee members sort of have different priority areas, there might be ways as you continue the work in your subcommittee, you could actually kind of divvy up those various forms of work. One thing to note is that working groups, so those could be made of 2 or fewer, 1 or 2. That's not really a working group, I guess if it's of 1, 2 task force members, can actually meet to work on an issue assigned by a subcommittee or by the task force without it being a public meeting. So I just wanted to put that out there as you all are starting to think where you might have the most expertise or where you might want to really jump in. That's something you might want to consider as you keep working and consider and planning for next steps. Any other thoughts here? It seems like there are sort of 2 kind of bigger pieces of what the subcommittee is proposing as its goals. And one piece of that is really, to the furthest extent possible, getting information about what is out there, what are the effects in these metrics that you've so helpfully kind of put out there. Is that alleviating structural challenges? To what extent is it actually bolstering or further complicating those barriers, those challenges? And then as the second interest would be actually providing some kind of roadmap type thoughts, right? Some kind of model or suggested way forward. Am I kind of capturing that correctly, that those 2 things are emerging for you all? Okay. I see some heads nodding and things like that. I'm wondering if you think we should let this sit, come back to it again, but wondering if we might want to have a little preliminary discussion to the extent that you all feel like you want to jump into sort of what's next here. Oops, sorry, we're seeing my comments here. Oh, you're still seeing my comments. Let's go back in. There we go.
Right.
Sorry, was someone gonna say something, Megan?
Oh, you closed the comments is all I was saying. Looks good.
Oh, okay. Thank you. We can go back in there. Thanks. It was a little delayed on the Zoom broadcast side of things. Okay, so what we had imagined today we could do, and again, this really is a proposed way that you can talk through the information you all already have or the things you've already started to learn about, the ideas you want to put out there. The discussion would be in 2 parts. One part would be what already do you know? What already do you want to kind of get out there into the discussion about existing resources? That could involve, I can pull up, right, some of this information, either that Excel spreadsheet, that resource list, or those briefing materials, and really think about how those existing resources, what do we know about them, what might require some further analysis, right? You've already given us a bit of a sense of that. And then the second part of the discussion today, we thought we could turn to that better funding report and see if in that there was anything that you kind of wanted to elevate as particularly important or something to unpack further. So if it makes sense to you all, we really had kind of come up with a few questions. So I'll put these here. And again, happy to kind of bounce back and forth through them. You've already, I think, started to bring up some thoughts in relation to these questions, but it was really meant just to have you reflect on what you learned in the briefing materials, or obviously you are all experts in your own right, in your own experiences of the work you do. What are some of the things you'd like to already set out as important for the subcommittee to consider? So I'll again open a slide and maybe write out some. Is that working well for people? Sometimes it can be distracting if you see your words typed out. I don't know how people are feeling about that, or if it's kind of helpful to see the notes taken real time.
It's fine with me.
It's working okay. Okay, awesome. So I'll open it from here and see if anyone has anything they'd like to jump in and say here.
This is kind of a funny place to start with a gap, but one thing that when I was looking at both the Excel sheet list of resources and just thinking about the landscape of kind of stakeholders, to me, one gap is like capacity for the organization, like for the resources that are working, whether that be organizations or specific programs, like they're not all resourced enough to support the whole state. You know, I mean, like I kind of obviously like everybody's like carved out regionally and things like that, but I think that one gap is that like the programs and orgs that are doing really good work to solve this problem don't have enough money. I know that's like not normally how we think about like gaps per se, but like I think that's an issue. Because it kind of addresses the like not remaking the wheel aspect of all of this. Sorry, Leah, go ahead.
No, I was like, I wasn't going to bring it up first either, but and also like, is there consistent state funding
Right.
for these kinds of programs instead of having to scamper and, you know, compete over grant programs? Are there some programs that we'd want to really resource consistently? And you know, we've got some programs that have that, and then some programs that don't, you know, like cooperative extension, and there's different programs that have expected funding while others don't. And obviously I work for California FarmLink. FarmLinks themselves are just a term, a name that specific type of organizations that work on land access have adopted. So there are different state farm links, but they are not related to each other, although sometimes we have a conference, which is very fun. But some, I've noticed, have state funding, have consistent state funding, and the state has decided to fund them. So obviously I have you know, an interest in that, and maybe I recuse myself, but I'm just gonna put it out there that like actually having land access programs that have state funding and some of these other wonderful programs that are supporting land access, consistent funding.
Also note that on the Excel sheet that was prepared, understanding the both the mechanism for the funds, like you're saying, Leah, and the length of time that it has been funded, like when, you know, are there, because, and I'm just saying this because there was you know, a lot of one-time funding that was put into recent budgets, state funded funding, and some other programs have been around for longer and are funded through a more stable source. And understanding that like funding mechanism, and then also the legislation associated with that, because there's some really important details on who prioritize and serve through those types of funds when it does come through state legislation, and could be different entity types, like Leah said, also, you know, in other states, or nonprofits, resource conservation districts. Some of those are all funded by the state directly.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that point that when when we have one-off funding sources, huge chunks of that funding are spent on planning for then a program, building the infrastructure for that program that is then only able to be utilized once. So it can often be a bit of a, I don't want to say waste, but it's, you know, it's a challenge to have to build all this infrastructure for then a program to not be consistently funded.
I think coordination is also a challenge here because there's so much specialization across kind of the support network. I think there's examples where that works really well, where organizations and the state, like are all able, or maybe like depends on what we're talking about in terms of state engagement, but like having like readily available lines of communication to move from like a parcel of land has been identified by a farmer, maybe even before it gets on market, to then line up like people meeting with, if they can't get a loan through, farm service agency or something like that, meeting with like dirt capital, and then like having the right amount of technical assistance to support the back end that's needed to get onboarded with them. And then also to like loop in real, like all of like coordination when that works well, like that's like a huge kind of structural change. Like it's a big paradigm shift when all the resources that any given farmer needs when they're thinking about land purchase, to have that all, like most people don't have that lined up ahead of time of like knowing who to talk to or how those kind of players interact with each other in support of this, land acquisition. So I think coordination is a big gap in kind of the resource landscape right now. To some extent, in some examples, it works so well.
Seems like what you're all pointing to here are a few different kinds of gaps, right? So gaps maybe in the programs that exist and how they're funded, right? But then also gaps in the programs that do exist and are funded, being able to like mobilize, communicate, coordinate, even have the capacity to fully realize like the potential, right, for land access with a program like that. I don't know if that captures a bit. It seems like there's a few different layers of gaps in what you're describing.
I don't know if we want to mention the gaps that were already pointed out in the document, because some of them were good, but I don't know if you've already kind of captured them. Like, few programs are open to people who are undocumented. Like some of the financing, because of the way it's structured, it doesn't support underserved farmers. They can't qualify for the kind of financing. Just the things that were listed here, I think that there are also, I don't want to have them as assumptions and then don't really list them because I think they're real barriers.
I think that eligibility piece is an important one if we wanted to delve in a little bit deeper to the actual like existing programs. But going back to what you said previously, Doria, like better understanding first the land transfers. But if we're looking at the program eligibility, also that I think that tells a lot about what we're dealing with, what we have, what's existing, like what are those eligibility requirements?
Right. I also was just looking at, of all of the different programs that are available, only 3 were grant programs that were payable to individual farmers. I think that things like that is a really big note, thing to notice, thing to note. Because that becomes like, and then the question becomes, well, how much are those 3 programs budgets? How many projects are they able to fund? How many people apply and don't get it? Who are they serving, you know? Just, yeah. Because if not everybody can access debt capital, then, you know, yeah, it just starts to paint a better picture of gaps.
Right, so gaps also in the actual, or gaps maybe isn't quite the right word here, but in the programs themselves, the way they're designed, right? And the way that they reflect some of those existing structural inequalities that then would change outcomes, even when outcomes aren't fully known, which is a request to know more about those outcomes.
Basically, just pointing out that there's very few opportunities for those who can't use debt capital financing to acquire land. You know, there's very few opportunities. Yeah.
Could I ask, just, obviously that point of land transfer is crucial to the discussion here, but I'm wondering beyond that experiences, like what you've seen in your own experiences too. So once that transfer is made, someone then acquires the land, but what resources are available to enable them to sustain that access over time? Just want to throw that out there. So as I said, we're focused very much on that point of land transfer, but what happens after that?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, and probably a whole nother like bullet. Because just to have the land doesn't mean you have water, doesn't mean you have infrastructure, and where's the support around that part, so that, because that would go to the question of how long someone can farm on that land. If they are never able to access those kinds of resources, then I'm not sure that the farming operation would be successful.
I'm wondering too, we have so many tax mechanisms that support landholders, but what tax mechanisms can we employ to facilitate land ownership and land transfer? And I'm not a tax specialist, so I'm just asking the question, having no answers there, but I'm wondering, is there like a tax benefit, tax credit for beginning underserved farmers for their first 10 years of owning land?
Or like a forgiveness of property taxes or something like that.
Yeah.
Although that gets tricky because this property taxes might go to like supporting the local school district or something like that.
I just wanted to point out something that I think we missed here in that FA, because free grants programs are eligible to individual farmers, and we should also add tribes in here. Tribal governments because I think that there might be some more within that list that are able to assist in land access for tribes.
So yeah, this isn't an and tribes, Thea. This is like a compare with tribes, or like, is that what you're saying?
No, and
it is an and. Okay, I wasn't sure if that 3 was still true there. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Want to go back to something that Ray had shared under G around like this piece of beyond land transfer, what happens after. And I know in a couple of different places we've seen models of like, buy, protect, sell, or that kind of thing with like open space open space authorities and land trusts and things like that. And I will just say that, like, anecdotally with the farmers that I've worked with who have purchased land either from land trusts or kind of basically with land trust, is like the reason that works well when it works well is because farmers can start farming the land that they know they're going to have a reasonable opportunity to purchase someday. In the meantime, when anything breaks that's big and expensive, there's this giant, well-resourced entity that can support, drilling a new $70,000 well and rebuilding $1 million barn and like doing those things so that they'll last for another 50 to 100 years before the land transfer happens. Conversely, that also means that sometimes people don't actually want to end up buying. They're like happy enough renting in perpetuity. And I don't know if that's I think that's fine too. Like, I think that's, if people feel like they would rather work, collaboratively with a land trust so that they were able to keep their expenses down and like have less risk and fear. Like, I think that's interesting. It's not the same thing as like, creating intergenerational wealth through land ownership, and kind of helping farming and agriculture persevere in the same way of like independent ownership. But I think it's just interesting to think about both.
Yeah, that's a really good point, James. Just thinking about maybe not all farmers are, or individuals, maybe not everyone wants, maybe that model is more conducive or comfortable, or, I think, again, there's so many different scenarios, and farmers sometimes aren't willing to take that risk, particularly if it's a very expensive property or something like that. Or, there's a whole lot of scenarios, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, dealing with individual situations. But when we were looking at the grant programs that were eligible for individuals, it could also, that would include, or maybe we should just make sure to include that scenario of not just only land ownership, but maybe it's like secure land, a secure tenure of some kind, whatever that may be, whether that's with a land trust, whether that's with a cooperative, whether that's with a tribal government, whether that's with a community garden. I'm not, there's a whole lot of different scenarios there.
I think if we go in that direction, it'll be important to point out the kind of pluses and minuses of each kind of structure, because one of the big things about that kind of tenure is that you're not building equity. And so as you age as a farmer, what do you retire on? Like, what do you, how do you grow old? And you can't farm forever, like, do you just become homeless when you're no longer able to farm? No.
That might also bring up an area where there really isn't support, right, for farmers who do leave. I know there's some other conversations that involved other kinds of mechanisms for well-being, right? So I think maybe you're all pointing to within existing resources, not having land ownership might then restrict a lot of the kinds of well-being or improvements or, future, right, livelihood. Maybe that is like kind of fully absent from existing sets of resources. I'm not sure if you all have an idea. If they're all kind of moving you toward ownership or reliant on ownership, what else is there, or what else could there be, is a question.
Farmer retirement planning, retirement accounts. It brings up for me a topic that we have not yet fully made the connection with in our land access and land tenure conversation, which is succession and transition planning. So there are a few different ways that we could talk about that in this space. One, that there is, the succession tsunami that is going to be coming upon us, and that is a whole other kind of bucket of land opportunities and farm opportunities that are going to be coming at us fast. And that is also where we often see, consolidation or investment buyers coming in and scooping up those opportunities, where those are potentially really prime opportunities for new and beginning farmers to access businesses that already have a lot of infrastructure built into them. So the succession topic is a land access opportunity. But we also, in talking about, building equity, that a farmer's equity is in their land ownership. Well, it is tied to that land. So if they have not diversified any income, they have to sell either their land and or business in order to have the money to retire on. So it forces sale. And our mini rant, our tax laws are structured such with succession that a farmer is penalized for selling or transferring their land ownership while they are alive. And so there's an opportunity there, I think, both in a whole pool of land access and in facilitating and incentivizing the transfer of lands and businesses that are transitioning to new and beginning and underserved farmer populations. So how do we support that retiring generation that, potentially has to move, to leave their home, to provide for a new opportunity, and who very likely has not planned for retirement outside of buying their farm? So and the other challenge being that in the time that they bought their farm and built their farm, the price gap, the gap of what that farmer needs to retire and what that new farmer can afford to buy into, we're trying to find creative solutions to bridge that gap, but that gap is really huge. So therein lies a problem and opportunity.
That would be a good topic for the big committee, our task force at large. If there are any existing programs that attempt to address this, we could look at that within the subcommittee. But then hopefully we will hear from, maybe that could be a future agenda item for our big task force. We're inviting some speakers to talk about that specifically.
To talk about the, just make sure I understand, to talk about the points Leah was just making about succession, land transfer, the existing sort of barriers to that process, ways to make it better, right? That's what you're making sure that's part of the task force meeting.
A suggestion.
Okay.
I think finding places where there's like an easy, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, like maybe it's even things like, you don't need to pay like closing costs if it's for farmland or something like that, or like there's just less like extra fees, extra process, like extra red tape, like cutting back some. I know that stuff has like, there's reasons for all those things, but like, are there places that can be reduced, or I like exploring the tax implication piece too, about like reducing tax burden and or creating incentives for the kind of operate in support of either land purchase or like making payments for the first 10 years of ownership. That piece coupled with like reducing the barriers to succession planning and or selling while you're still alive would be good as well. it does bring up a question for me around like somebody buying land for ag in like what does ag mean on that land kind of is an outstanding question, and kind of here being guarded against the prospect of somebody coming in ostensibly farming but really just kind of taking advantage of all of these processes to get a parcel. Like there needs to be like vetting around, I don't know, that's like an important piece of all of this, because one thing that I also know is happening across the state is people are buying good ag land just to have land, just to have more land that's not being used in agriculture, that's not being used to forward, I'm going to say the broader sustainable agenda of, agricultural goals in the state. And how to like, I guess what I'm saying is that like at the end of kind of any recommendations or solutions, we should run this through a filter of like how could this be manipulated against the goals that we have for it.
I also just like kind of piggybacking on that, I totally hear what you're saying. And I wonder if there's a way, if we're exploring tax incentives or whatever, to match that with kind of farming outcomes, that they would
like
be
incomes too. Yeah.
incomes, or I mean, is you try to figure out how to make it so that not only big operations get the most tax benefit, so there's an equitable thing like that, but yeah, I don't know exactly how you would do it, but if those kinds of land access tax incentives for farmers was also related to ongoing farming activities, like it would be released according to ongoing farming activities, not so somebody could just say, I'm going to farm and get a big break and then sell it to a developer.
Or like inversely proportional to gross income or something like that, where like the less money you made annually as a farm business, the more incentive, like the more of a break you would get, versus like if you were making millions of dollars farming, you could kind of modeling what our tax code should look like in the state, but like
Right.
specifically for agriculture, where the
So
people who are,
very
like
successful farm businesses wouldn't need as much of an incentive, right? Because they're successful. But ones that are getting started or struggling might need more support getting started and could get more successful quicker if we had a better structure.
I love that inverse benefit idea. That's so great. Speaking of which, related but adjacent, so there's a concept that we've been exploring. And so I have a couple of suggestions maybe that would go under like the FSA category or other financial institutions. So one way we're seeing folks try to fill the gap in transferring land and business ownership to a new generation is they're utilizing just seller financing. And seller financing can be great, but it can be really kind of challenging and complicated, and folks don't really know what they're doing. Most folks are doing it for the first time. And then there's an FSA program, the land contract program, that could be, first of all, not available in California. It's supposed to be. No one in California through FSA knows how to do it. And right now it's just a guarantee. So if for some reason the sale no longer goes through, it's a guarantee for the seller. But I feel like that program could be expanded since we're seeing so much more seller financing to offer some additional securities for the buyer as well. Also, there's a need, and this is in the weeds, but there's a need for companies that will like create the documentation and help process payments for seller financing to support these transactions. So I think there's more opportunity there. It's an untapped option given high interest rates, all of these things that we're seeing with our financial institutions right now. It also, in some cases, can get more money over time, but slower for the seller so that they can kind of transition out. Because as we know, it typically is their home as well. So the sellers can kind of have it's a little bit of a slower transition, which can help everybody and can offer an opportunity for mentorship, which is really important as well. And then the other thing that I'll say about a potential FSA option here, since it was mentioned, kind of reverse benefit on grant programs, there's a concept of reverse amortization. So a reverse or balanced, I think either is great, but right now, when you get a land loan or a mortgage, you pay your interest first. So you're not building equity for several years when you buy land. And those first several years are really crucial for a farm and a farm business to be building equity, and a really challenging time for a new farm. So what if either the amortization was balanced, meaning interest and principal are 50-50 throughout the life of the loan, or flip it. Instead of paying interest first and then moving more towards paying down your principal, you're paying down your principal first and then moving more towards paying down interest. So these reverse or balanced amortization schedules, I know obviously FSA is a federal program and we're talking state, but I think that this is it's a really interesting concept. There are some challenges as like FarmLink is exploring this. Literally the software won't do it. Like anyway, there's a couple of little nuanced challenges that financial software just doesn't understand it. But these are those kind of baked in, we just accept them as that's how it's done, when there is no reason it needs to be done that way. It's just to the benefit of the financial institution to put interest first. I will step off my soapbox now.
Before you do, Leah, have you seen that anywhere in practice?
I have not seen it anywhere in practice. FarmLink has been talking about it for a couple of years and looking into how to make it happen. For ourselves as a community development financial institution. But, if we could bring it to a federal program like the FSA and ask them to solve it,
Yeah.
with bigger impact for sure. And we could ask some of my colleagues to come into advisory committee, or I think we would want to maybe have an advisory committee of financial experts at some point here to talk through some of these things. So that's not my expertise, but I'm very interested in it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Leah. You can, as a subcommittee, bring in, let staff know who you'd like to hear from. And we can make sure that with your, guidance, find the right people to talk with, so that you don't all have to know exactly how this all works. But that's very helpful, Leah. Any thoughts? I'm keeping an eye on time, just so you all know. We have 45 minutes left in the meeting. We'll want to include some time for public comment. And I do also want to make sure that we have time for you all to discuss what to do next, right? So maybe it is inviting in a financial specialist who could actually chart out some suggestions that might make it in that you would want to share then to the full task force, right? Things like that. So I want to make sure we have some time for that as well. I'm wondering where you all we started talking about ways out, right? Solutions, best practices, other kinds of avenues for supporting land access and secure tenure. Do we want to kind of keep that ball rolling? Should we talk about that a little bit and then make sure we'll try? Megan, I don't know if you want to jump in just with a little time check and let us know what time we really should kind of start thinking next steps. If you're there.
Probably in about a half an hour. So, and what we don't get to, we can decide to talk about next round.
Awesome. Okay. So, maybe it's here. Anyone wanted to say anything more? I mean, there's more here. We can talk about more questions. We can also use the better funding report if it's valuable to kind of maybe start unpacking some of these other suggestions. But this actually, what you've all been describing, I think is actually much more kind of comprehensive about resource allocation than maybe what the better funding report was looking at, which was really state and local governments and delivering public funds. So that might narrow us down, actually. I'm not sure where you'd all like to go from here. Anyone have a thought about how you'd like to spend the time from here? Someone would like to put something up for discussion.
I'll just offer, I think this is a really interesting aspect of equitable access and what we were just talking about. All of these things are getting into the really important details. I think it also feels like a really big, it feels like almost like a whole nother topic. Like, I don't know if this subcommittee can tackle both grants and resources and also, or maybe this is resources. I don't know. It feels like a lot. That's just my opinion. And maybe if we, we haven't really decided how long we'll have the subcommittee for, what's an appropriate time. Is this more important than the other? I don't know. It just feels like this could be a whole different topic or subcommittee to go into these barriers in terms of private financing, private, sales and ownership, things like that versus, public dollars, programs, things like that. That's just my feelings in this moment.
I hear what you're saying. I almost feel like we need to see that landscapes, to understand what exactly is happening, like where are we seeing effective land transfer, and I feel like once we see those numbers, we can decide on where to focus, but to have it be informed by the numbers, I hear what you're saying is too much. It's too much stuff, but I wouldn't like to make, without being informed by the numbers, I wouldn't like to make a choice at this point on what we do and don't do. Yeah, that's just me.
If I may, I think it's very useful to really kind of gather a full spectrum of ideas from you all. And it does feel like a lot. And I think every subcommittee will be faced with a similar challenge when you first start to dive into the topic. We're not really making it easier yet because we don't have a structure for your recommendations report, but I've heard a lot of things that were shared already this morning that you can decide as a group. We want to take on this task of figuring out where effective land transfer is first, and that's going to inform your next series of conversations. But you've already outlined some really important issues and key questions, and how that translates into the recommendations document is still very squishy, if you will. You might pick a couple things, like 2, 3, 4 things that you can really dive into and pull apart and be very specific with the recommendation that you put forward. But there may also be a supplementary piece where you can outline, these are questions we still have, or we would like to see funding or effort into a kind of a phase 2 where someone else takes on this research or this topic or something. So if I'm thinking about this in terms of what your recommendations will look like, I don't want you all to be limited by the amount of detail that should be included or should not be included, right? I know there's the collective goal of making the recommendations implementable and tangible, but that's all to say, I really feel like this is a really productive conversation, and we don't yet know the shape that these ideas are going to take later. Don't know if that's helpful or not, but I just wanted to bring it back to kind of the end goal-ish.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Megan. I think the way we're sort of thinking about how the subcommittees can work as well is and that's been the purpose of today, is for you all to think about sort of from a blue sky standpoint of what are the issues and what are some of the things that we can be moving forward, but then to think as a group, what of all of that do you want to take on internally? What are things that may be better suited to the task force more broadly? What are specific research questions or information requests that you have for SGC to take off and answer for you? Are there folks that we want to bring in? So that whole process of how we then act on all the things that we've discussed today, I think we'll talk about in a moment. But just to, not overburden this one subcommittee, be tasked with addressing all these questions, but just to put out there that there are these different ways of approaching each of those things, some of which are internal to this group, but many of which not necessarily.
And some of which might also require other expertise be brought into the conversation, which you had already all mentioned. I did want to quickly follow up, Doria, with your comment about sort of first seeing the landscape of how people are mobilizing resources to get land access, and then understanding what and how to dive in. And so I'm wondering to what extent all of you on this subcommittee what could staff do, and then what could you do from your own sort of experiences to help build that out, if that makes sense. So Leah, you shared actually a lot about what you are doing right now at FarmLink to try to mobilize some of these ideas, right? So those are examples of the work that you're all doing on the ground. I'm just wondering how we can best support, if getting a sense of that landscape is valuable, if any of you have thoughts, suggestions, guidance you can give back to staff in this moment to make sure that you have the information that you need. And I know some of those metrics were shared earlier, but just wanted to ask that at this point. Is there someone to bring in? Is there like report things that you all would like to share out here?
I think a tax person might be good to talk. Like, I think having a tax specialist, particularly around like implications with purchasing, housing purchases, things like that, that could be interesting. I also like, while there's not a ton of folk, I mean, I think talking to people who've gone through this process, and like doing kind of a deeper interview, like a 30-minute interview with people who, particularly like socially disadvantaged folks who have gone through the process of purchasing a farm property, like getting some just like very, very ground truth experiential, like this was the hardest part, this was the easiest part, this, and I'm sure those experiences are gonna like totally vary widely across like what worked for somebody probably didn't work for somebody else. And I think a lot of that has to do with like, could be relationships, could be just different stakeholders, goals, incentives, all that stuff. But it would be interesting to hear from people who've gone through the process directly. I mean, like KTA has helped at least a dozen folks in the last 5 years purchase property and own it. And, I'm happy to like either help connect them with SGC staff or kind of, talk to them myself. But I think that would be interesting and valuable to hear from people who've gone through it, what has worked well. I have talked to some of those folks and I have like ideas, but based on what they've told me. But I think having some interviews would be great.
I want to expand that too. I mean, folks have different experiences, the different ways that they've had to purchase and acquire land. And we're talking about a bunch of different programs here. So I wonder if we can get some representation from each of the different resources and grants that have been utilized. Someone who's gone through the FSA process, someone who's utilized one of these other programs, someone who's purchased land, through a buy, protect, sell process. To understand the different experiences as kind of part of the analysis that Doria had offered at the beginning.
Yeah. I almost wonder if this is kind of like a survey that goes to past participants or past applicants
Mm.
to all of these different grant programs to understand better their experiences and what happened, you know, after, if they were awarded, what happened and whatnot.
I agree with that. Having conducted kind of online surveys, I think that there's absolutely a place for that. And maybe it's a yes and, but I do like James's idea of like interviews. You get a little more from folks. And especially if you're kind of seeking, sometimes when you just put out a general survey, you really only get the negatives. So some of the answers aren't well-rounded and really reflective. Folks just want to kind of get through. So I wonder if doing a combination of that and some in-depth interviews might get us a more well-rounded take.
I like both because I do feel like sometimes, you know, we interview those who we know about and we don't know everyone. You know, so it can be skewed just because of who gets chosen to be interviewed.
Yeah, I agree with that, Doria. Also, just a note, like if I do think it's both. Like I agree. I think if we could do both types of sampling, it would be, you know, survey plus interview. Can we use funds to pay people for their time? It's a great incentive to be able to offer that for a 1 hour structured or non-structured interview. You know, can we make sure to include both, you know, tribal recipients of funds, the Tribal Nations Grant Fund, and other funds that are specifically from the state or federal, and make sure that we're including, if we're going to do interviews, make sure that we're including some of those interviews in languages other than English to really capture what are those experiences for underserved groups that we're really trying to better understand those experiences, you know, in this whole process as a task force. We want to make sure that the program, whatever recommendations we're coming up with, that they're serving those most historically underserved first.
No, I think my question has been, I was just thinking through the mechanics of, because it sounded like at first when we were talking about getting folks to come in, if that would initially look like what we had in San Diego, where people are sharing their sort of lived experience of working, you know, being on the receiving end or trying to access available resources. But this is a broader statewide effort, much larger sample size, I guess. And just seeing in terms of the way that you all would like to receive that information, I guess, in terms like us, we go off and either do that work ourselves or contract with some third party entity to conduct that survey and the interviews, and then we're reporting back in the form of a report, or I don't know, I'm just trying to, how can we do this work in a way that's most useful to what you'd like to see out of it?
I think,
Yeah, sorry, go right ahead, James.
oh, I was just gonna say, I think, with survey, like I think surveying would be really interesting. The only thing that I think is important for that is that the survey be very simple and kind of like extremely quantifiable, like very, very like 1 through 5, how did this go? Like that, like simple, not like full narrative write-ups about things. That I think would be better through like an interview to like really understand the nuance of the like challenges of the process. But I also am saying that because I've sent out a bunch of surveys to farmers recently, like in San Mateo County, and I think like it's hard to compensate people for surveys versus like an interview. But I do think that some kind of incentive, like I think for the last, we did a big producer survey for all the agricultural producers on the coast, and I think we did like a $500 like random generated, somebody will win $500 for doing this survey. And I think some type of incentive for surveys is like helps encourage people to do it. It helps us capture more information, but parsing out like the data validation piece, if it's like a long comprehensive like short answer, please tell us. Like, I think that would be really interesting and useful, but I don't know if we can like, that's like a huge endeavor. That's like a statewide survey that's either backward feeding out from existing grants or just being spammed across like everybody's listservs for anybody who's a farmer who's purchased. And like getting the capture that I think we'd hope for would be challenging. But I think if we identified like maybe a couple of programs that we wanted to survey participants of, coupled with interviews with people, like in-depth compensated interviews with people who've gone through the process of purchasing, could be great.
Yeah.
And then also like at some point,
I
my comment about the tax person is like at some point down the road, like we need, that doesn't feel like.
I wonder if the survey could include a question, if you are interested in being contacted to conduct a 30-minute interview, please include, please say whether you're willing to do that. And I don't know if our survey is going to be anonymous or not, but if it was anonymous, then include your contact info here.
I mean, so I guess I would love to hear feedback from other members, but in my brain, this survey would be reaching out to past applicants of the programs that we're discussing as already existing. Just so that we're not just looking at their data and we're not just looking at what they write about themselves, but actually hearing from the people who have been interacting with it and trying to get resources from it. Not so much every single program out there, but the ones that we're specifically looking at as serving California.
Right. It sounds like a kind of layers of data that you'd all like to consider. One would be what are the metrics we have access to, kind of push on that, Doria, as you were first saying, what can we know, what numbers can we get? Another would be this survey that you're all describing, which would be trying to actually get a more comprehensive understanding of who is successful, who's not successful, what barriers are different kinds of people facing, what are they even applying to? And then another would be actually talking with people about their experiences of trying to mobilize a variety of avenues to get secure land tenure. Am I kind of capturing and then all of those pieces of data would work together to provide this subcommittee with a landscape that then could be a foundation for pathways forward analysis of existing structural challenges.
One other thought occurs to me is that if we're speaking to all these folks, maybe there's an if you were awarded or if you were able to secure land section that doesn't go to everyone, but where we can ask some of the questions about what resources did you need after acquisition, and did you get those resources and whatnot.
I wanted to quickly note that I'm not live typing right now, but Megan is taking very extensive, just in case you're all wondering. There's still work for me to put this on there, but it is all being recorded very carefully. And we'll make sure we report back to you all what we heard.
I want to just flag potentially a little bit of a multi-layered challenge here. So one of the programs that we've identified is SALC, Sustainable Ag Lands Conservation Program. The recipients of SALC are the land trusts, but then the land trusts now have a mandate to utilize, the SALC funds toward increasing land access for underserved farmers. And so I don't know who, I wish like that there was a way to kind of get the end user there in a more easy kind of report or something, but there isn't. DOC doesn't really have a list like that. I've asked. So we might have to then reach out individually to land trusts that are engaging in that type of structure, which I think is an important piece for us to talk about in future meetings, which is just that now that there is this mandate, now that we understand kind of the power that using those funds towards land acquisition for farmers of color rather than just to the benefit of folks who already hold land and equity, that those land trusts need to retool, need to re-educate, need information and support. So I think that that's an opportunity as well, understanding how land trusts can interact more with farmers. It's something that I'm myself working on in my program. So just flagging it. We were talking about process, but a lot of land trusts, you know, they're very short-staffed, to be honest. So moving towards embracing working lands for farmers and farmers of color, I think is something that they're going to need support to do.
I did want to ask, I don't mean to cut anyone off if someone else is going to jump in, but if there are, so Leah, you just mentioned the SALC, if there are programs as staff start to consider sort of, I think the task that you've sort of set out for staff to put back to you, right, to share out a proposal way forward from here. If there are ways that you could imagine how to prioritize certain kinds of, like, I know FSA has been, right, its programs have been mentioned. Are there priorities, or it really is let's take the like full breadth of that landscape and let's dive in? Just wondering if there's any guidance there from the subcommittee.
Well, I think like Doria mentioned earlier, there are very few programs that are actually, it's, you know, eligible for individuals.
Okay.
So those, you know, and even SALC, it eventually, I mean, it is essentially doing that, but through a secondary channel of the land trust. I think those are the programs that would, if we're going to narrow anything down, you know, we to understand those programs and how they're, you know, facilitating access to land. And then, as Doria was again bringing back to that initial brainstorm of understanding how, you know, that land transfer, how's that fitting in, you know, how are these programs actually doing that, and then sampling either applicants or successful applicants, success project recipients of those programs, to better understand their experience. I like the idea of a larger survey. It just might have to be a more medium-term goal, perhaps, as we move further down to better understand what quantitative data we actually are looking for here. Yeah, just my thoughts.
I would just add to that too. I think first, well, for us anyways, first understanding what quantitative data or any data we already have somewhere, and to avoid bombarding folks with additional surveys if we can. So
yeah, I am wondering if from here, sort of talking about, hold on, let me get us where I'm thinking. That's back to that. If we were to consider, right, the next steps, what staff need to do from here to bring back to you what you as subcommittee members want to do from here that can then give guidance to staff, and then how to kind of report that back to the full task force. So it's a lot of questions right there, all wrapped into one. But if anyone has a sense of kind of where they see this conversation leading us from here, would love to hear your thoughts on that. Is it about staff creating a proposal that includes a survey? Here are the sort of specifics we heard you say, demographics, things like that, that would be included. Give that back to you for feedback. What could happen from here that you all feel would keep your work moving forward and support you in that work? We know that you all don't have all of the time in the world to spend on this. So how best could we be of support?
I mean, I would love it if staff could help us by gathering together some of the answers to the quantitative questions that we asked on, the different, those things, and kind of lay it out for us. And then look for any existing surveys of these applicants. So we don't repeat asking people the same things that they've been already asked. And then from what exists, see if there's holes in information that we may still want, that we may want to use to compose a survey that wouldn't be repetitive, and then propose what that survey might look like.
Okay.
So in the next meeting, we would review all the data that was able to be put together so we can understand what the landscape looks like. We can see a proposal for a survey based on, eliminating what kind of information is already available from those applicants.
I think it would be great if we could interview some people who've gone through the process between now and the next meeting, or at least between now and the next general meeting. Just to get some firsthand experience of what has gone well and hasn't. It's not going to be as representative as the survey, but I think it'll be informative. And then I'm just personally curious about this, like thinking through the kind of inverted tax things and reverse amortization, or yeah, I'm curious. So Leah, I might like ping you about that between now and the next meeting to I'm just like, yeah, I want to like think through how that would look in practice. But it's like I think those are like tax incentive things are powerful levers that can be changed at the policy level that hopefully these recommendations will be implemented on. So I'm going to do a little more homework on that between now and the next call.
Would it be helpful if we had like a presentation on existing tax incentives and so, kind of people who are working in the field or working to transition or transform those things or address them, like what the recommendations are in the next meeting? Like gather those people together and have them present for part of the meeting to talk, to give us like that full education.
Totally.
I think that could be really cool.
Committee or for the full task force?
I mean, I was thinking about the subcommittee, and then we could, kind of suss that and bring back what we think is important to the full task force. Yeah.
There are some other tax incentives that exist in other states. So we might want to pull in someone from California is ahead in a lot of ways, but not necessarily this one. So we might be able to borrow from some other states. I will say that most of them right now tend to be structured to incentivize existing landholders or retiring farmers. So to kind of take some of those suggestions and then maybe also bring in a California-based tax specialist who could help us come up with recommendations that kind of give it a California flair might be good. And I am wondering if we need this is grants resources, if we maybe need like another subcommittee that is really just honing in on finance and resources as their own kind of category here, because there is definitely a lot that we could dive into. And it typically takes, capital stacking, right? It takes a combination of grants and financing resources in order to make these deals ultimately come to fruition. So I think that might be a good plan.
And as a reminder there, it could be a separate subcommittee, and that might be something that then could be, right, it would then be brought back to the full task force. Maybe some people would like to join something like a finance subcommittee. Another way to think about it would be as subcommittees, if that works, if that makes sense. In the form of kind of assigning different members of the subcommittee to really go unpack hear from some specialists, come back to the subcommittee, and then the subcommittee goes to the task force. So there are several different ways that that work could be organized, and we'll take guidance from you all, right, in terms of the capacity you all have to engage in this work, and then how best to make sure that it is sort of channeled and up to the task force as a whole.
And then how is all of that different from, so like we could invite specialists to come and talk to us within this subcommittee or a subcommittee of this subcommittee. Or we can create an advisory committee, because I see us wanting to at some point bring in folks who are from financial institutions, from CDFIs, from FSA, you know, to really help us understand the landscape better.
I feel like this has a huge capacity to spin out and be very generative in terms of like tons of information, but maybe not focused around equity and access and disadvantaged farmers. And I wonder if there's a way to focus the conversation around the kind of primary goals of this task force, because you know there's lots of problems and issues in financing of farms in general, but I wonder if we can focus it on, you know, what are the specific issues that are related to equity and access to land.
Maybe that's a decision that we could make after we kind of get a landscape, like more of this data first, and then look at it again and have those more focused questions to either a new subcommittee or subcommittee, or, you know, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to vote one way or another on that yet until there's a better understanding of those existing programs. But I agree with you, Doria.
Can I just ask a clarification question for James? You mentioned, I think, doing the interviews and then bringing the outcomes of those interviews to the next full task force meeting. Just noting that that next full task force meeting is about a month away. I'm just wondering, it might be, or at least from our side, I think, like to conduct those interviews, report back to this next subcommittee meeting, and then sort of the outcomes of that subcommittee meeting, what are being reported to the following full task force meeting. Does that align?
Yeah, I mean, whatever is logistically feasible is all good with me. I feel quasi urgency just in the sense of like we've got a year and less than a half now. But that doesn't, I think the thing that's more important to me actually is less about how quickly the interviews happen and more around making sure that we're interviewing people that are that are kind of representative of the insofar as there is like I want it to be like people who are like exemplars of people who this like would all be in service of, kind of thing. Like, so like finding socially disadvantaged farmers who have gone through the process of purchasing, or, you know, and like interviewing those folks, or even if it's people who haven't. I mean, I think starting from people who've gone through and purchased to like learn from that experience is really valid. And then I guess my hope would be that the survey or other capture would cover people who have like not been able to complete the process because of the struggles that we want to ameliorate down the road.
Yeah, well, that was the question I was going to have about the, you know, talking a lot about programs and then drawing on, it sounded like the sort of successful recipients of funds via those programs, but there's that whole, you know, multiplied by 10, those folks who've applied but not received funds through those, and it seems that warrants, you know, equal if not more attention to, yeah, that's it.
I'm looking at time, and Megan, I don't know if you want to take it from here, and I don't believe we have.
One quick comment about what was just said though before we move. Just to say that I do feel like it's really important. It will be important for us to understand the number of applicants who were not successful, was that a function of the amount of funding available? Or was it a function of the barriers, the hoops that people had to jump through in order to apply? Because I do feel like we need to suss that and sort it.
Mhm.
Because I'm not sure that people who did not successfully apply would even be on the list, right, of applicants because they didn't submit. And that is like a whole other group of people who, made it halfway through the application and realized they didn't have XYZ or didn't know what this meant or didn't, couldn't give evidence that they had been farming or whatever, And I feel like that's a whole other population that we're not going to get at by just going through applicant lists.
Right.
So Megan, I will pass it to you. I did want to just really quickly though say to a point that was brought up by Leah earlier about like technical advisory committees. So that is something that can and will be stood up to provide some of that technical expertise to the task force in its development of recommendations. So I just wanted to sort of affirm that is a possibility, and that as the subcommittees are doing their work, I think increasingly these more kind of tailored conversations will generate a very clear, well, we have to have this perspective, we have to have these eyes on those recommendations, right? So that list is sort of being built up through the work that you're doing, and as you were thinking of kind of categories of a person to make sure is in that space, we appreciate that. So I wanted to say that, but I'll turn it to you, Megan, as like, just to make sure we finish on time.
Okay, and I first want to confirm that there's no public comments, request for public comments submitted in the form. That's correct, Tessa?
Correct.
Okay, excellent. Let's see, what do I want what do I want to see in terms of review and action items and follow-up? I feel like we were kind of formulating a plan here, and knowing that our full task force meeting is coming up in about a month. But clearly you all are interested to continue this conversation. And in fact, the conversation is expansive and there might be interest after a little bit more information is gathered of splitting this up into grants and resources plus grants and resources finances. Gosh, I have a lot of notes here. So I think that there's some clear direction for staff that we have got a couple of needs, couple of questions we need to answer in order to advance the conversation. Going back to Doria's original request from the beginning of the meeting, we need to figure out the actual number of land transfers from the various grant programs, pairing that with, actual metrics, like did the land transfers actually occur? How was the funding applied? Was it kind of a one-time thing, or is it an ongoing support mechanism? So that's number one, is a big question mark. And then that will also help us understand barriers for applicants who were not successful. Is it language barriers? Is it, requirements and things like that? And so that will help figure out how to move forward with determining how to address those barriers. Helping to understand those barriers is that survey coupled with the interview piece. So I would like staff there was excellent recommendations on how to approach the surveys and interviews, but I think we can take those suggestions and formulate a proposed approach. What's coming up for me is a teeny bit of a hurdle that we have to navigate as a subcommittee, because we can't really talk about this outside of a subcommittee meeting, but we do have an opportunity to talk about this at the August meeting. So I don't know if this is feasible, but we do have an hour scheduled right now in August for report outs of the subcommittees. And we can talk about this survey and interview approach there, and maybe have a proposal for how to advance that. Therefore, you as subcommittee members can reflect and speak freely and give us further direction on if it's something you want to advance or not. Meanwhile, we'll get another subcommittee meeting scheduled on the books for you, possibly late August, early September. There's some sense of urgency here. There's a lot of information to gather. So we have to kind of figure out what's feasible in terms of timing as we prepare and lead up to the August meeting, and then get you information in advance so that we can come and have a productive second meeting. There was another one that I highlighted here. Question 2 that was brought up of what resources are needed after land acquisition. Seemed to be like another key question that you all are interested in. Plus that piece on finances and taxes and loving the idea of bringing in financial experts, possibly at the next meeting to help discuss this issue, the inverse benefits idea, reverse amortization. So I don't know that there are specific action items for task force members, your subcommittee members right now, except to say that if along the way over the next couple of weeks, you think of existing resources or programs, or you do some of your own work that might help to answer some of these questions that will be useful for us to compile, please share that with us as staff. You're on this task force because of your day-to-day work, because you are experts and you are knowledgeable. So all of the stuff that you shared today, Leah, for example, was tremendously helpful and supportive. We're looking for more of that if you have it. We did have a question too about how is it useful for you all to receive information. So I know we're talking about surveys and interviews. We're talking about bringing in guest speakers. Other thoughts on that, summaries, memos, briefing materials in our last couple of minutes, anything that you all wanted to share or request back of us? Okay, so we have a report back at the August meeting. Subcommittee report backs currently we're looking at day 2, so it will happen on August 15th. I don't really know what that looks like for this group, except we'll probably want to give a summary of all the important things that you touched on. We'll produce a written summary, like we do for the normal task force meeting, so you can all go and refer back to that. Anyone want to volunteer right now to kind of lead that initial report back to your full task force members so we can get that bit of logistics out of the way? Okay, we'll draw straws. Maybe someone will feel brave coming up in August. Okay. Thea, we'll put you on as point then. Thank you for volunteering. And of course, your other subcommittee members can chime in. Timing, should I send out a poll? Do you want to get something on the books for possibly September? How does that sound? I know we need to do a little back end, like let's plug and play here, but kind of that time sounded goodish.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Excellent. Camille, great job leading discussion today. Anything you want to say, or Sean or Tessa, any last questions, anything we missed in our wrap up?
Sean had to leave a bit early, but said to say thank you. And I'll, of course, echo that to all of you. We really appreciate you coming to this meeting, being really ready to jump right into that discussion. It makes all the difference. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks all. Nice to be here and listen to the conversation. Have a good day.
Nice seeing everybody.
Everybody, thank you.
Great work together. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Oh, should we? Recording is stopped. YouTube is stopped as well, Tessa. We're good on that.
No, I think YouTube is still live.
Oh, okay. Well, let's end this meeting here, right? We'll all connect.
Okay, reconnect now or reconnect at 2?
At 2, I think. I don't think YouTube is still on, but I kind of want to make sure.
It does